So we're going to start looking at voting and public choice. So this is the business of getting governments into power. If governments are supposed to reflect the public choice or the views of society, what sort of mechanisms do we put in place to aggregate those preferences? So when it comes to microeconomics, we do a lot of work on individual choice. People respond to incentives. People make themselves as well off as possible. Whole concept of utility maximization. And you look at an individual's preferences, you can map them into a utility function, and then you can find the optimum consumption bundle. So with individuals, we can do that with budget lines and indifference curves. What should the person do? What bundle of goods makes a person as well off as possible? If we extend that into voting and public choice, the issue is, well, what policy choices make society as well off as possible? And that's essentially what we're considering in this scenario here. So public versus private choice. So making public choice is a messy business. So government decisions often require protracted negotiations or protracted election campaigns. People get to air different views and choose amongst different perspectives. So public choice theory provides an economic model of the political decision-making process. So what do we have? Well, we have an input, which is the preferences of voters. Then we have the democratic process in however that is organised. And then we have the output. And what is the output? That's the public policy stance that's taken. So over the next 2 or 3 months in Ireland, the democratic process we'll be engaging in is a referendum, where we basically give one vote to everybody who's eligible to vote. What will be the input? Well, it'll be their preferences. It'll be a crude measure of their preferences. The referendum will just be yes or no. Tá, no níl. Are you in favour? Are you opposed? It won't really pick up strength of preferences. So somebody who goes in and makes up their mind when they're inside in the ballot box and ticks one box or the other, their vote will get the same weight as somebody who spent the previous 2 months campaigning and going around from door to door and felt very strongly about it. So there will be some input based on the preference, and then you get the output, the decision. So even though Enda Kenny is going over to Brussels tomorrow to sign this thing, it doesn't come into force until the 1st of January 2013. So we'll have signed up and said, look, we're ready to go. 1st of January 2013, we're going to comply with this thing. But we'll have a bit of a referendum in the meantime. And if it's rejected, well, we might have to withdraw the signature. But it isn't until next January that it comes into effect. So the output will be public policy. Whether Ireland accepts or rejects the inclusion of these provisions in the Constitution. And that will be the output. So public choice theory is about modelling this. When it comes to individuals, it's a fairly straightforward process. The input is the individual preferences. The process is what they think, what they want to do. And the output are their consumer choices. But the key difference here is that with public choice, you have 1,000, 10,000, 3.5 million individual preferences. How do we map all those preferences just into one decision? So the reason that public choice is not as tidy as private choice, it's a typo there, is that governments must compromise between many conflicting interests. So it's not a straightforward set of preferences where you just choose the best or the outcome that leads to the greatest level of utility. With public choice, well, you have millions of people feeding into the policy decision. So it's difficult to model the process of public choice as maximising a single objective as we do for households and firms. So with households, we have utility. And you have fairly straightforward models of utility maximisation. With firms, you have profits and fairly straightforward models of profit maximisation. How does a firm maximise profit? Well, set marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. Cannot make more profit than in that position there. How do households or individuals maximise utility? Well, satisfy the equimarginal principle, so that the marginal utility per euro on each good is the same. And we can go through and work through those, and I'm sure you've used and come up with seen most of those in operation in an intermediate micro course in second year. Here with public choice, well, what is the outcome? Well, the outcome is social welfare. It doesn't have something that's easily measurable. Profits are very easy to measure. You can measure them with euros. Utility is difficult to measure, but because it's only one person, we're not too concerned about interpersonal comparisons. Just as long as that person makes themselves as well off as possible, that satisfies our view of the world as economists. That they are rational in their choices and making the choice that makes them as well off as possible. So we say people operate in their own self-interest. So just because we can't compare utility or satisfaction across individuals doesn't mean that people aren't making themselves as well off as possible. And self-interest can be across a whole range of things. Self-interest can be the Gordon Gekko view of the world. Greed is good. I have to get as much as possible from as many people as possible at as high a cost to them as possible. Or it can be the Mother Teresa view of the world. I have to give as much as possible to as many people as possible to make them as well off as possible. Both of those fit under self-interest. They're doing what interests them, what makes them happiest, what gives them the maximum level of satisfaction, whether it is taking as much as possible or giving as much as possible. So for households, we have a fairly resilient model of individual choice. But when it comes to the public choice, one of them is when we don't know what we're measuring in aggregate. What are we trying to make as large as possible? Social welfare. What makes a whole group of people better off? Is it giving them more money? Is it giving them more services? Is it giving them more freedom? Is it giving them more equality? Is it giving them better air quality? Whatever it might be, there could be a whole host of factors that feed into it. And different people will have different preferences. So deciding what's in the public good can be quite difficult. So if it comes down to a government making a choice, so 17 people sitting at a cabinet table with a legal expert beside them, do they know what's best for the community as a whole? Or then when we go to a referendum and we allow everybody to feed in their preferences, if we're just asking them yes or no, is it allowing us to measure public choice? So we're looking at voting and public choice. We'll just start by looking at the voting decision. So why should an individual vote, given that many people do vote? Is voting itself rational? Does it satisfy the conditions of individual choice? Is majority voting a satisfactory method? So the upcoming referendum will be decided in the system of majority voting, and it's simple majority voting. 50% plus 1. If 1 million people vote, the one that gets 500,001 votes will win. Whether the other one gets 499,999 doesn't matter. It's simple majority voting. If there's any gap there, whatever the valid poll is, whichever option gets 50% plus 1 will be the option chosen. So do the decisions reached reflect the preferences of voters? Did 500,000 people who are sort of half in favour of it vote yes? And did 500,000 people who were strongly opposed to it vote no? Did people who were indifferent counter those who were very strongly opposed to it? And is majority voting an efficient method of collective decision making? Could we look at different choices? The most extreme being unanimity. We won't do it unless everybody agrees. We're not going to get that with 3.5 million people. But there are some decision making bodies which operate on the basis of unanimity. One of the most visible at the moment is the UN Security Council. If the UN Security Council is going to issue a resolution, i.e. reprimanding one state or recommending particular action, it has to be unanimous. So most members of the UN Security Council have backed a resolution against Syria and the ongoing dispute and perhaps close to civil war that is ongoing in that country. But it was blocked by Russia and China. In fact, it could just be blocked by one of them. In order for a resolution, I think there's 11 members in the UN Security Council, 5 or 6 permanent and 5 or 6 transitory. But in order for it to be passed, it must have unanimity. So that gives huge power to each voter. So you can imagine what odds would the fiscal treaty have of getting passed if the referendum was on the basis of unanimity. That everybody with the vote, who does vote, must vote yes. What cost would go through in terms of that? Or you can have qualified majority voting. Why pick 50%? Why not say we need 66% approval or 75% approval, where you qualify the majority by a particular amount? One of the most high-profile examples of qualified majority vote in Ireland over the last 10 years was the opening up of Croke Park by the GAA. A rule change in the GAA requires a qualified majority of 2/3. So it's not 50%. So if you're going to change a rule in that organisation, you must get 2/3 of those voting, whether it's at a club, county board, or in the case of Croke Park at National Congress. So this vote had come up a number of times and had been defeated. And it got quite close on a number of times. I think in one occasion it was defeated by a small minority of votes, 5 or 6 votes in one direction or the other would have swung it. So this was an issue that was supported by what we'll call the majority, more than 50%, but the voting mechanism required a vote of more than 66%. So there was talks of fellas getting lost in the toilets and voting differently and not putting up their hands, and it went on for a couple of years till eventually Bertie said, look, here's 20 million to finish off Croke Park. If you let other sports in, we'll give you the 20 million. He said that the night before. They voted the day after, they voted yes, and it was open for the 5 or 6 years and subsequently closed. So the provision wasn't permanent, but it allowed to stay open while Lansdowne Road, subsequently the Aviva Stadium, was being built. Well, knocked first and then being built. But the issue was the voting rule used. If it had been a simple majority, it would almost have passed first time. But it took continual proposals of the rule change before it finally crossed the 66% threshold. When it comes to qualified majority voting, we'll also see it in relation to the European Commission. When the European Union was small, even when it was the European Economic Community, it operated on the base of unanimity. If there were going to be changes, every member had to agree. And some changes are still on that basis. So when it came to the Treaty of Nice, the Treaty of Lisbon, if it was rejected in Ireland, it didn't go through. It needed unanimity. So we had substantial power there, that when we rejected the treaty, we had to get asked again. When it comes to this treaty, it's not on the basis of unanimity. If 12 of the 17 Eurozone members agree to it, the treaty comes into effect. So we can't say we'll vote no or else. There is no or else. They'll just say you voted no, fair enough. And as long as we vote no, we're likely to be kept out of sort of aggregate Eurozone mechanisms. So if we vote no, we'll be out of the European Stability Mechanism. That if we need another bailout, well, they'll say, sorry, we're not giving it to you. You're supposed to impose these fiscal discipline rules in your constitution. You didn't do it. We're pouring all this money into a bailout fund. We're not giving it to you. That is only if we need a new program. We're in an existing program. They can't kick us out of this. We're in this for as long as it takes to get our deficit down to 3%. But if down the line, 10, 15, 20 years down the line, we make a mess of things again and need another bailout, we won't be able to access it through the European Commission, or sorry, the European Union, and particularly the European Union Bailout Fund, which will now be called the ESM. There still is the IMF, and perhaps we could go to other sources to get funding, but we wouldn't get it through Europe. So in this instance, if we vote no, the outcome is a bit different. With unanimity comes substantial power. Here it's 12 out of 17. So we're looking at voting rules, all these issues sort of raise and come up. So the first issue we'll consider is why to actually vote in the first place. Why take the time and effort to go to a polling station, to cast your ballot? Is your vote going to count in the upcoming referendum? Well, it will count, but will it make a difference? What will decide whether you vote or not? If opinion polls come up to the referendum, say it's going to be 75-25 in favour or against, one way or the other, doesn't really matter, would that encourage or discourage you to go to the ballot box? If somebody said, or the opinion poll said it's 50-50 on a knife edge, would that encourage you to go to the ballot box? So when looking at the decision to vote, we can go back to microeconomics. In so much the same way as somebody goes out and buys a good or a service, we can say they're doing it to make themselves as well off as possible. Why take the time and effort to vote? So we utilise a microeconomic theory of voting behaviour referred to as the rational voter model. So it's just basically sort of an addition to the rational consumer model, but look at it not in terms of buying something, doing something, voting. So the decision to vote is assumed to reflect the expected utility from doing so. Is it in my self-interest to vote? Can I make myself as well off as possible by voting or not voting? However, in a classic account of rationality, we find there's a paradox of voting. It could not be considered rational to vote, yet many people do. So if you want to make yourself as well off as possible in a pure utility context, voting doesn't make much sense. Yet it's likely there could be a turnout of between 45 and 55% in the upcoming referendum. So consider a policy that a voter would like to see implemented, or a party would like to see win an election. So 12 months ago we had a general election. In the next 3 or 4 months we'll have a referendum. So each voter calculates the value of that policy being implemented, which yields utility UX. Am I in favour of putting these rules into the Constitution? What might that be worth to me? Am I opposed to these rules being in the Constitution? Do I want a particular candidate elected to a local or national parliament? What would that be worth to me? What have they promised me? Do I want a particular government to get into power? What are their policies? Are they in favour of the abolition of third level fees? Let's vote for them. Let's get them to sign a pledge outside Trinity College and say they won't increase third level fees. What is that worth to you? What's it worth to you? Not a lot. Who signed it? Are you listening or not? Rory Quinn signed the pledge. So before the election you have to think that the pledge is worth something. Could I get money by having Labour in power? And perhaps you could. So the model argues that voters will also calculate the likelihood P that their vote is decisive and will make a difference to the outcome. So again, this is, what do I know beforehand? If I vote, is it going to influence the outcome? If the outcome is already pretty much a foregone conclusion, I might be getting this benefit for having a particular option chosen, but if the election is going to go one way or the other anyway, I'm not going to make it any more likely that I will get that benefit, simply because the outcome is pretty much predetermined. So the value of P will reflect the size of the electorate and how close the election is, or more particularly how close it's expected to be. So a formula for the probability of being decisive is given by the following. We don't have to know or learn or understand all the elements here. Just looking at some of the elements. Will my vote count? Is my vote going to be decisive? Where decisive means turning the outcome from one to the other. If I don't vote, this outcome will occur. If I do input my vote, I can switch the election in favour of the outcome I prefer. So most of it is fairly straightforward. E and pi are just mathematical numbers. Pi is 3.1415. E is 2.71. That's Euler's constant. And pi is the ratio of a circle's diameter to circumference. Don't know who discovered that, but they're just numbers. The key elements in terms of the election are N, which is the size of the electorate, the number of voters, and Q is sort of the expectation before and what the split will be. The expectation, the proportion of votes that each party or policy option is likely to get. So will my vote be decisive? Well, it depends on the number of voters. If it's a 3-man committee, clearly my vote is going to be decisive. Unless the other two are going in one way or the other, where their Q will be 0, my vote will be decisive. If it's split 50-50, then with a 3-man committee, my vote is clearly going to be decisive. If it's an election of a couple of million people, and it's fairly expected that it'll go one way or the other, well, my vote isn't going to be decisive. So the size of the electorate and the expectations beforehand have a big impact on the probability of being decisive. So P will be highest if the election is close and if the electorate is small. And finally, we must consider the cost of voting. Actually going to the effort of going to the polling station, getting the ballot, and the time spent involved in it. So this includes the time spent considering the various alternatives, listen to somebody talking about fiscal rules which may not make much sense, their likely impact on the voter, if these things are in the Constitution, does it bother you, as well as the opportunity cost of the time spent voting. If you're local, it could be 5-10 minutes to go down to the polling station. If you have to travel, it could be a couple of hours, all time spent in the act of voting. So in this instance, the expected utility from voting is given from the following. If a person buys a product, we can work out or know what utility they'll get from it. The expected utility of voting is P times the utility of the outcome they prefer. So P, the probability of being decisive, UX, the outcome, the utility of the outcome they prefer, minus C, the cost of voting. So this is the benefit, and this is the cost. One issue with the formula, you can see the cost is guaranteed. If you go to the bother of voting, you will incur the cost. The expected utility only comes with a certain probability, and that's based on the probability of being decisive. If the outcome you prefer isn't chosen, well then you get no benefit. You voted but it went the other direction. If the outcome you do get comes true, well it depends on how likely it is that your vote swung it in your favour. So the probability of being decisive. So we'll just briefly look at three examples. A local election, a national election, and a student election. And in which should you vote? So consider a local election with an electorate of 50,000. So in a small county, a small town, large town or a city, a small ward, considering the election of a local candidate. So the value of having your preferred candidate in power is 1,000 over 5 years. They promise to get the roads done, or try to get you through to get a medical card, or try to get some waiver on some charges, whatever it might be. They've made a promise to you that you reckon is worth €1,000 over 5 years. And the cost is simply the time allocated to voting. So we'll assume it takes half an hour for the person to vote, at a cost of time of €10 an hour. We'll just put a monetary amount on the value of time. Whether it's giving up work or just giving up time, giving up an alternative, we'll value it at €10 an hour. So the cost of voting is €5. So using the probability of being decisive formula, we find the following. What is the expected utility, as given by this formula here, for a person to vote in the local election with an electorate of 50,000? The expected utility is negative €2.30. There is a benefit, of €1,000 from getting their candidate into power, but their probability of being decisive is very, very small. Fewer than 1 chance in 300. If there was 300 elections, they'd swing at 1 in 300 of those. So the actual benefit to them of voting is weighted by the probability. So even though their person gets 1,000, the likelihood of them being decisive, whether that person gets in or not, is very, very small. So the cost to them is negative €2.30. If you look at a national election with the same benefits, but say it's a US style election, perhaps with 100 million voting, vote for the Republican candidate, whoever it comes through to be, or the Democratic candidate, who will more likely to be not be Barack Obama. Well, I suppose it's almost guaranteed to be Obama. With 100 million voting, if the person goes to the polling stations, here their probability of being decisive is tiny. Out of 100 million voters, what are the odds of you swinging it one way or the other? So the cost here is actually the cost of, almost the entire cost of going to the polling station. What about an election that may mean very little? A very small costs and benefits, and in the greater scheme of things might be considered somewhat nonsensical. A student election. So the benefits and costs associated with a student election are much smaller. So assume the benefit is €100. They'll get you a free ticket or a free drink, or get you something that you'll value at €100. And the cost of voting is just €1. I'm not saying that your time is worth a bit less, but it'll be done in a much quicker time. With an electorate of 1,000. So a student society. In this instance, the probability of being decisive is much greater. With an electorate of 1,000, one single vote will be decisive 1 time in 50. So an electorate of 1,000, 1 out of 50 elections will swing one way or the other because of one vote. When it comes to a student election, we see the expected utility is positive. This is the only one in which it makes rational sense to vote in this sort of abstract and very limited view of the world. So of the 3 cases, the student election is the only one in which it's worth voting. And in fact, because of the probability of being decisive, in which election are you most likely to be harassed for your vote? which election will you get free sweets? Why is your vote worth something? It's because of the probability being decisive. The smaller the electorate, the more valuable a given vote is. So that's just a rational voter theory. Suggests you shouldn't vote. Clearly lots of people do vote, so tomorrow we'll consider why it is that people do vote.